Something fundamental is shifting, and most Americans still don't see it. China isn't just trading with Iran anymore. Beijing is making a calculated strategic move to anchor Iran inside a broader anti-Western alliance, one designed to bleed American power slowly, quietly, and without firing a single shot at us directly. When China backs Iran, it isn't charity, it's chess. And the target on the board is American dominance in the Middle East, the dollar's grip on global energy markets, and the forward-deployed U.S. bases that have defined our strategic posture for decades. Those bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Diego Garcia, they exist on the assumption that no rival power can effectively arm, fund, and coordinate our adversaries simultaneously. That assumption is now dead. Beijing just buried it. Iran gets economic oxygen, China gets a pressure point, and America gets a strategic problem that no aircraft carrier group can simply sail away from. This is what a real power transition looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, but permanent. Let me be direct with you about what's actually happening here, because the mainstream conversation in Washington is missing the depth of this entirely. What we're watching unfold between Beijing and Tehran is not a transactional relationship born out of convenience. This is a deliberate, long-term architectural decision by China to construct an alternative power structure, one that doesn't need American approval, doesn't operate inside American-designed institutions, and frankly, doesn't fear American sanctions the way it once did. And if you want to understand why that matters for U.S. bases, for American soldiers stationed across the Middle East, and for the broader question of who runs this world in 30 years, you need to slow down and think through what Beijing is actually building. Start with the economics, because that's always where real power begins. China became Iran's largest trading partner years ago, and that relationship has only deepened as Western sanctions tightened. Now, what Beijing is doing isn't simply buying Iranian oil at a discount, although they absolutely are doing that. What they're doing is systematically building a financial architecture that allows Iran to function, to survive, to arm itself, and to project power regionally without ever touching the US dollar system. They're processing transactions through alternative channels. They're building yuan-denominated trade corridors. They're integrating Iran into what eventually becomes a parallel global economy, one where American financial leverage simply doesn't reach. That's not a small thing. That is a foundational shift in how global power actually operates. Now think about what that means for Iran's military capacity. Because when you remove the financial pressure that sanctions were designed to create, you remove the brake on Iranian weapons development and regional aggression. Iran's drone program, which has already proven itself devastatingly effective in the hands of Houthi forces in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, that program gets better, gets faster, gets more sophisticated when Chinese technology and Chinese investment flow into it. And let's not pretend we don't know this is happening. The U.S. intelligence community has said it. Allied governments have said it. The evidence is sitting right in front of us. So when Beijing throws its economic and political weight behind Tehran, the practical military consequence is that Iran becomes a more capable, more confident, and more dangerous adversary for every American service member stationed within range of Iranian missiles. And that range is considerable. People need to understand the geography here. U.S. Central Command operates across a vast theater, from the Horn of Africa up through the Arabian Peninsula, through Iraq and Syria, into the waters of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. American bases at Al Udeid in Qatar, at Ali Al Salam in Kuwait, at Al Dhafra in the UAE, the naval base in Bahrain that hosts the Fifth Fleet. These are not abstract dots on a map. These are facilities housing thousands of American personnel, billions of dollars in equipment, and the command infrastructure that America depends on to project power across the entire region. Iran has spent decades developing a missile and drone arsenal specifically calibrated to threaten exactly these targets. And with Chinese backing reinforcing Iran's economic and technological foundation, that arsenal is not standing still. What's changed, and this is the part that Washington consistently fails to articulate clearly to the American people, is that Beijing's support doesn't just help Iran sustain itself under pressure. It signals to the entire region and to the world that challenging American primacy now comes with a safety net. That is geopolitically enormous. Before this deepening of the China-Iran alignment, a country that chose to defy American power had to calculate whether it could survive the economic and potentially military consequences alone. Now, that calculation changes. If you're Iran, you look at Beijing standing behind you and you understand that the United States cannot simply squeeze you into submission the way it might have in an earlier era. That gives Tehran a kind of strategic confidence it has never had before. And strategic confidence in geopolitics translates directly into willingness to push, to probe, and to escalate. We've already seen the consequences of that confidence playing out in the Red Sea, where Houthi forces backed by Iranian weapons and Iranian logistics have been interdicting global shipping for months. The United States Navy has been conducting sustained operations against a non-state force equipped with Iranian-origin drones and missiles, and that non-state force has not stopped. Think about what that tells you. A relatively small, resource-limited proxy force has been able to sustain a campaign against the most powerful navy in the history of the world because the supply chain feeding that force, the weapons, the technical expertise, the intelligence, flows from Iran, and Iran now operates with Chinese economic protection behind it. That is not a coincidence. That is a system working exactly as Beijing and Tehran designed it to work. Now let's talk about the broader strategic picture, because this China-Iran axis doesn't exist in isolation. It is one component of a larger network that Beijing has been quietly constructing for over a decade. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS expansion, the Belt and Road infrastructure investments across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. These are all pieces of the same project. China is building a world in which American power has diminishing reach, diminishing credibility, and diminishing relevance. Iran is a critical node in that project because of its geography, because of its energy resources, because of its demonstrated willingness to confront American power directly, and because of its relationships with proxy forces spread across multiple countries. When Beijing invests in Iran, it's not just investing in one country. It's investing in an entire network of influence that stretches from Lebanon to Iraq, to Syria, to Yemen, to Afghanistan. That network is the infrastructure of a new regional order, and China is financing it. The question Americans should be asking, and almost nobody in our media or our political class is asking it seriously enough, is what happens to the American strategic position in the Middle East if that order consolidates? Think about it honestly. The American presence in the region was always premised on a certain set of assumptions that regional states would cooperate with American security frameworks because the alternative was instability and economic isolation, that oil-producing states would price their exports in dollars and recycle those dollars through American financial markets, that American military superiority was so overwhelming that no combination of adversaries could credibly threaten our forward deployed forces. Every single one of those assumptions is under serious pressure right now, and the China-Iran relationship is one of the primary drivers of that pressure. Saudi Arabia, which for decades was the anchor of American strategic influence in the Gulf, has been negotiating with Beijing and has already normalized relations with Iran under Chinese mediation. Read that sentence again. China mediated a diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That used to be unthinkable. It happened. The UAE has been pursuing independent relationships with Chinese technology companies and diversifying its strategic partnerships. Even Iraq, where thousands of Americans died and hundreds of billions of American dollars were spent, has a government that maintains close relationships with Iran and is now deepening economic ties with China. The architecture that American foreign policy spent decades building is cracking, and it is cracking precisely because Beijing has been systematically offering regional states an alternative path, one that doesn't come with American lectures about governance, American military presence on their soil, or dependence on a dollar system that Washington has increasingly weaponized. Here's something else that doesn't get discussed honestly enough. American sanctions, which were designed to be the primary non-military tool for coercing adversaries into compliance, are becoming less effective at exactly the moment we need them most. Not because our adversaries have become better at hiding transactions, although they have, but because the alternative financial infrastructure that China has been building is now substantial enough to provide real relief. Iran trades in yuan, Russia trades in yuan and rupees. Countries across the global south are settling bilateral trade in local currencies and bypassing the dollar entirely. Every time Washington uses the dollar system as a weapon, and we have used it aggressively, sometimes recklessly, we give other countries one more reason to accelerate the construction of that alternative system. Beijing understands this perfectly. China has turned American financial aggression into the single most effective recruiting tool for its alternative order. So when we look at U.S. bases in the Middle East and ask whether they're at greater risk because of Chinese support for Iran, the honest answer is yes, but the risk is more complex than incoming missiles, though that risk is real. The deeper risk is strategic irrelevance. It is the possibility that American bases in the region persist as expensive, vulnerable, politically sensitive installations in an environment where American influence over the regional order is steadily declining. We could find ourselves in a situation where we are paying an enormous military price in dollars, in lives, in political capital to maintain a presence in a region that is actively reorganizing itself around Chinese economic power and Iranian regional influence. That would be a strategic disaster of the first order, and it would be a disaster that we walked into with our eyes open, having been warned repeatedly by events that were impossible to misread if you were actually paying attention. Let me tell you what a strategic serious America would do with this information. It would stop pretending that more of the same, more sanctions, more forward deployments, more rhetoric is going to reverse a trend that is now structural. It would recognize that the China-Iran alignment is a symptom of a broader failure of American grand strategy over the past 2 decades, a failure rooted in overextension, in the misuse of military force, in the weaponization of the dollar without a coherent long-term plan for managing the backlash, and in a political class so consumed with domestic dysfunction that it has been unable to think clearly about America's position in the world. It would begin the hard work of reconsidering what American interests in the Middle East actually are in this new environment, what presence is truly necessary to protect those interests, and how to rebuild American credibility and influence through competence and consistency rather than coercion. But a strategically serious America would also be honest about the timeline. This shift has been building for years. The China-Iran relationship didn't emerge overnight, and it is not going to be reversed by a single policy decision or a single administration. What Beijing has constructed and what Tehran has become inside that construction represents a genuine long-term challenge to American power. The kind of challenge that requires strategic patience, strategic clarity, and strategic honesty that has been almost entirely absent from American foreign policy for a generation. The American people deserve to understand what is actually at stake here, not the sanitized, oversimplified version that gets served up in congressional hearings and cable news segments, but the real strategic picture, the one where decisions made today will determine whether the United States remains a genuine global power or gradually becomes one significant nation among several, navigating a world it no longer shapes. That is the world Beijing is building. That is the world Iran is helping to build. And that is the world that our current trajectory is delivering us into, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not.